Let's get started. Story number 1.
I've always enjoyed winter camping. There's something about the stillness of the snow-covered woods that brings a sense of peace and solitude. So when the opportunity arose to camp near the Cascades in late December, I jumped at it. The forecast called for a moderate snowstorm, but nothing that would stop a seasoned camper like me. I packed my gear, loaded up the truck, and set off for a quiet spot just beyond the reach of any major trails. The first few hours of the hike were nothing out of the ordinary. The snow had already begun to fall by the time I arrived at the trailhead, the light flurries gradually turning into a steady snowfall as I ascended into the woods. The trees loomed above me, their branches heavy with snow. The world around me was eerily quiet, save for the crunch of my boots in the powder and the occasional gust of wind rustling the evergreens. By the time I reached the campsite, it was already nearing dusk. The storm had intensified and visibility was poor. The wind howled through the trees, driving the snow horizontally. I had to work quickly to get my tent set up. My hands were stiff from the cold, and my breath came out in white clouds as I struggled with the tent's poles. After a few moments, I managed to secure it, though I could already feel the temperature dropping rapidly. I built a small fire to cook some soup and warm up, but the storm was relentless. It wasn't long before the fire sputtered and died, the snowflakes falling faster than I could keep up with. The storm was stronger than I had anticipated, but I was prepared. I had plenty of gear to keep me warm for the night. Still, as the wind howled around me, I felt a tinge of unease creeping up my spine. It wasn't the storm itself. It was the silence. Everything seemed to be muffled, like the snow had absorbed all sound, leaving nothing but the wind's unholy howl. As darkness settled, I crawled into my tent and zipped it up. I had a headlamp and a small lantern for light, but I didn't want to waste the battery. Instead, I sat in the dark, listening to the storm rage outside. The silence inside the tent was comforting, but my mind began to wander. The eerie feeling persisted, nagging at me. I pushed it aside, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. But the feeling didn't go away. I tried to fall asleep, but sleep didn't come easily. The wind howled, and the sound of it was so loud that I kept thinking I was hearing voices in it. The storm outside seemed to be getting worse by the minute, and my thoughts drifted back to stories I'd heard about ghostly sightings in the mountains, strange whispers in the wind, figures that seemed to follow you but were never quite there. I laughed it off as ridiculous, but it didn't stop my heart from racing when the wind seemed to quiet for a moment, then suddenly pick up again, sounding like faint whispers. It wasn't until much later that night, when I was just about to drift into a fitful sleep, that I heard something. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too rhythmic. Crunch, 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 footsteps, faint but deliberate. I shot up, my heart racing. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, casting a beam of light out into the dark. The storm was so thick that I could barely see past the entrance of my tent, but I thought I saw something, just a flash of movement, a shadow in the snow. I hesitated, unsure whether to investigate or stay hidden. The storm was vicious now, and I was alone out here. But the footsteps were so clear, so real. I couldn't ignore them. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling despite myself. There was no response. Just the howling wind and the relentless crunch of footsteps getting closer. I unzipped the tent slowly, my breath coming fast, the snow swirling around me. The world outside seemed like a blur, but I couldn't see anyone. Still, I could hear the crunching of snow. It wasn't coming from the trees. It was too close, right at the edge of my tent. My pulse raced in my ears as I stepped out into the storm, shining my light frantically in every direction. But there was nothing but swirling snow and the sound of my own breath. I called out again, "Who's there?" No answer. The footsteps had stopped. I turned back to the tent, my mind a whirl of confusion and fear. My rational mind told me it was just an animal, perhaps a deer or a wayward raccoon, but something didn't sit right. The footsteps had sounded deliberate, too heavy for a small animal. And the way they stopped so suddenly, like whoever it was waiting for me to call out. I crawled back into the safety of the tent, zippered it shut, and tried to calm myself down. The wind outside grew stronger, but the footsteps had stopped. My heart rate slowly returned to normal, but the strange feeling of being watched lingered. I lay there for hours, the storm outside crashing against the walls of the tent, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept hearing things scratching at the tent, soft whispers that seemed to come from all directions. It was too much to ignore. I pulled my coat tighter around me, hugging my knees to my chest. Then, as if to confirm my growing fears, I heard it again, clearer this time, unmistakable. A voice. "Help me." The words came from the direction of the tree line. I froze, my blood running cold. It was a voice, a real human voice. Quiet and distant, but undeniably clear. "Help me." The voice repeated, a soft, mournful sound that made my skin crawl. I scrambled to unzip the tent, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I wanted to call back, to offer help, but fear held me in place. What if it was someone who needed help? What if it was a trap, some twisted ploy to lure me into the storm? "Who's there?" I shouted, but my voice seemed lost in the wind. There was no answer. Only silence. Then, from the darkness of the storm, I thought I saw a figure. A shape. But it wasn't quite right. It didn't move like a person. It was more like it was just there, standing in the storm, watching me. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone. But the voice lingered in my ears, a faint whisper, repeating over and over, "Help me." I stumbled backward into the tent, quickly zipping it shut again. I couldn't explain it, couldn't understand what I had seen or heard. My heart raced and my breath came in short, panicked bursts. I knew I had to leave, but the storm was too powerful. There was no way I could make it down the mountain in these conditions. I was trapped. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I saw the figure standing just outside my tent, staring at me through the snow. The whispers never stopped, growing louder as the night wore on. When dawn finally broke, I packed up quickly, leaving the campsite behind. I didn't want to linger any longer. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never return to that spot again. Some places aren't meant to be visited, and some storms bring more than just snow. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The snow came fast, faster than we expected. It had started as a light flurry when we left the truck behind, trekking deep into the Wyoming backcountry. The plan was a 3-day winter camping trip. Me, my brother Kyle, and our 2 friends, Matt and Jason. We had done plenty of summer trips, but we wanted the challenge of real winter survival. By the time we reached the valley where we planned to set up camp, the wind had picked up and the snowfall had grown heavier. The world around us turned white, the trees vanishing into the blur. "We should turn back," Matt said, shaking snow from his hood. "We're fine," Kyle insisted. "It's just a squall." It wasn't. We got the tents up just before dark, fighting against the wind. The temperature had dropped fast, the cold cutting through our gloves as we built a fire. Snow piled around us, making the forest eerily silent except for the wind's low howl. Something felt off, but I kept it to myself. Maybe it was the way the firelight flickered strangely against the trees, or how the storm seemed almost unnatural in how quickly it had arrived. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, I heard something. Crunch. Footsteps in the snow. I held my breath. The wind had died down, leaving only a heavy, muffled silence. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving just outside my tent. I glanced toward Kyle, who was sleeping beside me. He hadn't moved. Crunch. They circled our campsite. I told myself it was Matt or Jason getting up to relieve themselves. But then, another sound. A whisper. Low. Faint, right outside the tent wall. I didn't move. I couldn't understand the words, but they weren't in a voice I recognized. It sounded wrong, stretched, thin, like wind through a crack in the ice. Then silence. I stayed awake for hours, heart pounding, but nothing else happened. In the morning, I stepped outside and saw them. Footprints. They circled the tents in a looping, chaotic pattern. They were deep, fresh, and they weren't ours. Matt and Jason denied leaving their tents. Kyle laughed it off, saying it was just the wind shifting the snow. But I knew better. By midday, the storm worsened. The wind howled through the trees, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. We had planned to stay another night, but now even Kyle agreed we should leave. We packed in silence, the tension thick. I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see something standing there. Just as we were finishing, Jason stopped. "Guys," he whispered. "Look." We followed his gaze to the edge of the clearing. There, half buried in the snow, was a shape. At first, I thought it was a fallen log, but then I saw the outline. A body, a man, face down, arms twisted unnaturally. His clothes were ragged, torn, and covered in frost. His skin, where visible, was black with frostbite. We didn't move. No one spoke. Then Kyle took a step forward. We need to check if the thing moved. Not like a normal person. It jerked stiff, like a puppet being yanked by invisible strings. Then it lifted its head. Its face was wrong, hollow. Its eyes, if they had ever been there, were now just black voids. It opened its mouth. The whisper from last night, a plea, a desperate, wordless sound. Then it pushed itself upright, unnaturally fast, and took a step toward us. We ran. We didn't stop for our gear. We didn't look back. We tore through the snow, barely able to see, lungs burning from the cold. Somewhere behind us, I heard it. Not footsteps, not crunching snow. Sliding. Like something dragging itself forward. We reached the truck just as the storm broke. The second we were inside, Jason turned the key, peeling out onto the snow-packed road. No one spoke for miles. When we finally stopped for gas in the nearest town, Kyle broke the silence. We need to tell someone. But when we checked the map, something didn't make sense. Where we had camped, where we had seen it, there was nothing. No valley, no clearing, no recorded trails, as if the place had never existed. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The wind howled like a living thing, shrieking through the dense pines as the snow thickened around us. The forecast had warned of a light snowfall, nothing serious, just enough to dust the ground and make for a picturesque winter camping trip. But by the time we realized how wrong they had been, it was too late to turn back. We were deep in the woods of northern Montana, miles from the nearest town, our car parked on the narrow, unplowed road leading into the wilderness. It had taken us hours to snowshoe to this spot, a clearing near a frozen lake where we had set up camp beneath towering evergreens. The four of us, me, Jake, Anna, and Mark, were seasoned campers, but we had never braved a winter trip like this before. That first night, the snow began falling steadily, a quiet and beautiful curtain that settled over everything. We huddled around the fire, our breath curling in the frigid air, swapping stories over hot cocoa laced with whiskey. It should have been the perfect night, if not for the unease that settled over me as the temperature dropped. The woods felt different. Not just quiet, but unnervingly still. No distant hoot of an owl, no rustling in the underbrush. The wind picked up in eerie gusts, whispering through the trees in a way that almost sounded like voices. By the time we crawled into our tents, the snow was coming down harder. I zipped my sleeping bag up to my chin, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling prickling at my skin. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a noise, a crunching sound, footsteps in the snow. I held my breath, straining to listen. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow through the thin fabric of my tent. The wind had calmed, leaving an eerie silence, but the crunching continued, slow and deliberate. Someone was walking around our campsite. I turned to my side and saw Jake's sleeping bag still full. I whispered his name. No response. Then I tried Anna and Mark. Nothing. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to stay still. A shadow moved against the fabric, blocking out the dim light of the embers. It stood there, unmoving. I don't know how long I lay there, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst from my chest. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the shadow moved away. The crunching resumed, growing fainter. I forced myself to breathe, slowly, quietly. Then I sat up and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The campsite was empty. The fire was almost out. And then I saw them. Footprints. Not just one set, but many. They circled our tents in strange, looping patterns, almost like they had been made by someone shuffling through the snow aimlessly. Except they weren't ours. I reached over and shook Jake's shoulder. He groaned and turned over. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. "Hear what?" I hesitated. Footsteps. Someone was walking around the campsite. He frowned, rubbing his eyes. "You probably heard the wind." "No, I saw the footprints." At that, he sat up, glancing outside. His face darkened. "What the hell?" The others stirred awake as Jake and I stepped outside. Anna shivered and hugged herself. "Did you guys walk around last night?" We all shook our heads. "Then who made those?" Mark muttered. The snowfall had stopped, leaving behind a thick white layer that made the tracks impossible to miss. They crisscrossed the campsite in strange, looping trails. But what made my stomach churn was that none of them led away from the clearing. It was as if whoever made them had just disappeared. Mark grabbed the hatchet we had used to split firewood and scanned the trees. Could be some hunter messing with us. At 2 in the morning, Anna snapped. We argued for a bit, trying to come up with a reasonable explanation, but none of them made sense. Finally, we decided to pack up and head back at first light. Whatever was out there, we weren't sticking around to find out. But as the day wore on, a storm rolled in faster than expected. The wind howled through the trees, thick snow falling in blinding sheets. Turning back wasn't an option. We were stuck. That night, we built the fire higher, keeping close together. Nobody said it, but we were all thinking the same thing. We weren't alone out here. Sometime past midnight, the sound came again. Crunch, crunch. We all froze. The fire cast flickering shadows as the footsteps circled us. This time, there was no mistaking it. Jake grabbed the hatchet. "Who's out there?" he called. Silence. Then from the darkness, a voice, a whisper, low, raspy, just beyond the firelight. "Help me." My skin went cold. It came again from a different direction. "Please," Anna whimpered. Mark grabbed her arm. "Who are you?" Jake shouted. "Nothing, just the wind." And then something stepped into the firelight. At first it looked like a person, a man maybe, but there was something wrong with him. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as if he wasn't used to walking. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, there were no eyes, just hollow sockets that stared right through us. "So cold," it rasped. Anna screamed. Mark scrambled backward, knocking over a pile of firewood. The thing took another step forward. Its mouth stretched open wider and wider until it was an empty, gaping hole. Then the wind surged, howling through the clearing, and the fire went out. Panic erupted. I grabbed for my flashlight, but my hands were shaking too badly to switch it on. I heard Mark cursing, Anna sobbing, Jake shouting. The footsteps were everywhere, circling us, closing in. And then, nothing. The storm passed. When I managed to flick on the flashlight, we were alone. The fire was smoldering. The snow was pristine, except for the places where we had scrambled in terror. But the footprints were gone. Not covered. Not erased. Just gone. None of us slept that night. As soon as the storm broke in the morning, we packed up and left, trudging through knee-deep snow back to the road. When we finally reached the car, frostbitten and exhausted, there was one final horror waiting for us. The snow around the car was untouched, no tracks, no sign that we had ever walked to the spot, as if we had never been there at all. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The snow came in heavy, thick flakes, swirling in chaotic patterns as we trudged through the knee-deep drifts. The forecast had called for light snow, nothing serious. But by the time we reached our campsite deep in the Montana backcountry, the storm had rolled in, fast and fierce. It was me, my brother Eric, and his 2 friends, Danny and Chris. We had planned this winter camping trip for months, wanting the challenge of surviving a weekend in the cold wilderness. We were all experienced campers, but nothing had prepared us for the storm that was closing in. We set up camp in a small clearing near the tree line, our tents pitched close together for warmth. The temperature had already dropped to single digits, and the wind had picked up, howling through the pines like something alive. We managed to start a fire, huddling around it as we ate, but the unease had already settled in my chest. Something about the place felt wrong. At first, I thought it was just the silence. Winter in the woods was always quiet, but this was different. Too still, too empty. No distant hooting of owls, no rustling from small animals, just the wind and something else beneath it. A sound I couldn't quite place. We sat around the fire for hours, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread. The snow continued to fall, covering our tracks almost as soon as we made them. The trees beyond our campsite blurred into dark, shifting shapes. By the time we crawled into our sleeping bags, the storm was in full force. The wind battered the tents and the cold seeped through every layer. I pulled my hat over my ears, trying to block out the noise, but something kept me awake, a feeling like we were being watched. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. Then I heard it. Crunch. Footsteps. I lay still, my breath shallow. The fire had died down, leaving the campsite in near total darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the snow outside. Crunch. The steps were slow, deliberate, circling the tents. I turned my head toward Eric's side of the tent. "Eric," I whispered. No response. The footsteps stopped. A long silence stretched out, so heavy I could hear my own heartbeat. I held my breath, waiting. listening. Then, suddenly the sound started again, this time right outside my tent. Crunch. Something, or someone, was standing just inches away. I felt a presence, a weight in the air that made my skin crawl. I slowly reached for my flashlight, hands trembling. Before I could turn it on, a voice cut through the storm. A whisper. "Let me in." I froze. The voice was wrong. It didn't sound human, not entirely. It was thin, stretched like something trying to mimic speech, but not quite getting it right. I couldn't move. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. The wind howled, the storm raged, but the presence had vanished. I don't know how long I lay there, rigid with fear, before exhaustion finally pulled me under. When I woke up, it was morning. The storm had passed, leaving everything buried under a fresh, untouched layer of snow. I sat up slowly, my body stiff from the cold, and then I saw them. Footprints. They circled our tents in looping, nonsensical patterns. But what made my stomach drop was the fact that they weren't ours. They were barefoot, in the middle of a snowstorm. I scrambled out of my tent, heart pounding. Eric, Danny, and Chris were already up, staring at the tracks. No one said a word for a long time. Finally, Danny broke the silence. "Who the hell was walking around last night?" Chris shook his head. "Not me." We all looked at each other. Eric spoke next, his voice unsteady. "There's no way someone was out here barefoot in this weather." My skin prickled as I followed the tracks. They didn't lead anywhere. They just circled the campsite over and over before stopping abruptly, as if whoever made them had simply vanished into thin air. Chris muttered a curse, rubbing his arms. "We should go." We all agreed. We packed up in record time, leaving behind the untouched firewood and the extra supplies we had planned to use for the next night. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the trees, but there was nothing. By the time we reached the trailhead where our car was parked, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains. As we loaded up our gear, I glanced back at the path we had just come from. There were no footprints. Ours should have been visible in the snow, but there was nothing. It was as if the forest had swallowed every trace of us, as if we had never been there at all. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The wind was already picking up when we set up camp, and by the time the sun dipped behind the mountains, the snow had started falling in thick, heavy flakes. The forecast had mentioned light snowfall, nothing we couldn't handle. But as we huddled around the fire, it was clear that this storm was going to be worse than expected. It was me, my cousin Daniel, and our 2 friends, Mike and Sean. We had planned this trip for months. 3 nights in the remote Colorado wilderness, testing our winter survival skills. We were all experienced campers, but none of us had been prepared for just how quickly the storm had come in. By the time we finished dinner, the wind was howling through the trees, shaking the branches above our tents. The firelight flickered wildly, sending strange shadows dancing across the snow. I pulled my coat tighter and glanced at Daniel, who was staring out into the dark woods. "You okay?" I asked. He nodded, but didn't look away. "I thought I saw something." "Probably just the wind kicking up the snow," Sean said. Daniel hesitated. "Yeah, probably." The storm only got worse as the night went on. We crawled into our sleeping bags early, knowing we'd have to dig out our tents in the morning. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind batter the fabric, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. At some point I drifted off. Then something woke me. A sound just outside the tent. Crunch. A slow, deliberate step in the snow. I held my breath, listening. Crunch. Another step. I turned my head toward Daniel. He was still asleep. The sound moved, circling the tent. My heart pounded. It wasn't the wind. I wanted to wake Daniel, but something in me, the deepest, most primal instinct, told me to stay still. The footsteps stopped just inches from my head. Silence. Then a whisper. So quiet I almost thought I imagined it. "Help me," I froze. The voice was thin, fragile. It didn't sound like any of my friends. I forced myself to breathe, inching my hand toward my flashlight. Just as my fingers wrapped around it, a long, slow scratch ran down the side of the tent. I yanked the zipper down and shined the light outside. Nothing. The snow was untouched. The forest was still. But I knew what I had heard. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a thick, untouched blanket of snow. I stepped outside and scanned the ground. No footprints. I told myself it had been a dream, that the wind had played tricks on me. But when Daniel crawled out of the tent, his face was pale. "You heard it too," I said. He nodded slowly. "Yeah." We didn't tell Mike or Sean. It wasn't until later, when we were packing up, that Sean mentioned something that made my stomach turn to ice. "I had the weirdest dream last night," he said, stuffing his sleeping bag into his pack. Someone was outside the tent, whispering. I met Daniel's eyes. Neither of us said anything. The weather turned worse that evening, forcing us to stay another night. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were all on edge. The second night was worse. Sometime after midnight, the whispers came back, but this time, they weren't just outside the tent. They were everywhere. Faint, breathy voices, moving through the trees, surrounding us. "Help me, please. So cold." I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't stop. The voices grew closer, filling the space between the wind gusts. Then came the footsteps. Crunch, moving, circling, faster this time. Daniel clutched my arm. "We need to go," he whispered. We tore out of the tents, yanking on our boots, grabbing only what we needed. Mike and Sean were already awake, their faces pale in the moonlight. The whispers had stopped, but the footprints were there. Hundreds of them. Deep, bare footprints in the snow, surrounding our tents in twisted, erratic patterns. No one spoke. No one moved. Then, just beyond the tree line, something stood watching. It was human-shaped but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The wind blew the snow between us, and when it cleared, it was gone. We ran. We left behind most of our gear, crashing through the deep snow, not stopping until we reached the truck. The whole way down, I felt it. Something following, watching. We never talked about it after that night. We never went back. But sometimes in the middle of the night, when the wind howls through the trees, I swear I still hear the whispers. "Help me." Story. The end.